that so that other members who weren't able to join us today will be able to see the session. Welcome to today's presentation. My name is Christine Mullins. I know it says at the bottom Beth Purcell, but I am not. So Beth may be joining us, hopefully. She's the president of CHRS, and she set up the WebEx platform for us. And I needed to get in, so I'm not her, but I'm acting as her. And I'm on the board of CHRS, so I'm really pleased to host today's Preservation Cafe. Maygene Daniels, welcome to present today. She's an architectural archivist and resident on Capitol Hill, so she's a neighbor, which is wonderful, and she's also on the board of CHRS, so we're glad to have her. She has two handouts. If you entered this meeting through the CHRS website, you will have seen the links to the handouts. But if you didn't, they are up there on the chrs.org, or you can post your email in the chat room and I'll send those to you. But they're two handouts that Maygene is wonderfully put together for us and share with us. And one is on 5 easy steps to find out about your home and to do the research. And then the second handout is house history resources. So those will be really helpful after you've watched this presentation. So I'm going to turn it over to you, Maygene. Thank you so much for joining us today and for presenting.
Thanks so much, Chris. I'm delighted to have so many neighbors this evening who are joining this talk. I'd like to begin by thanking Chris Mullins and the Capitol Hill Restoration Society for making in one of the most beautiful and historic neighborhoods in America. In talk to understand how our neighborhood developed and where your own house fits into the historical picture. At this moment, during the pandemic, with our libraries and archives closed, there are some resources that aren't available. I'll talk about these at the end of the presentation. Nonetheless, there's a tremendous amount of material that's available online. We need to thank the extraordinary institutions that have placed the materials online, including the Library of Congress, DC Public Library, and the DC History Center. I'll plan to introduce you to available resources at the same time that I give you a quick overview of the origins and growth of Capitol Hill. With this introduction to provide perspective, I'll explain a simple way to approach this material and learn about your own home in what I call the 5 easy steps. And then I hope there will be time for questions. At the end of this talk, especially, I hope that you'll have learned enough to share my excitement and delight in the history of our amazing neighborhood. So I'm going to begin at the beginning. My first slide is a map of the city showing land ownership and development in 1790. Planning for the city began. The slide map was a century, but in 1790, L'Enfant Plan was created. But what you'll see is land. This is a helpful place to begin because it shows that the city, and especially Capitol Hill, was basically built from scratch in the 19th century using L'Enfant's ambitious plan. Nothing needed to be things they're building. There were no paths that were followed on Capitol Hill. On the ground, the survey and more. Published 1790. And here's the detail in the Capitol Hill area. A map that you see today. If you've ever wondered about the varied size of city blocks or the varied distance between streets, you can see it all laid out here. As many of you know, Thomas Jefferson put his, but it was George Washington himself most deeply engaged of the new city. Here you see George and family, Martha and the grandchildren, posing with the map of Washington, suggesting just how important the city plan was to Washington. This painting by Edward Savage, by the way, is in the collection of the National Gallery in the Andrew Mellon collection. And here's of the map. You can see more clearly. Potomac, the Potomac is right here. The Anacostia is here. Oops. And I like to think that these little squiggles are where we are right now. Washington's vision shaped the city's future in other ways beyond its street plan. He and others thought extensively about what they wanted to look they wanted the city to look like. And during his administration, Washington issued the first city building regulations. One of these provided precise guidance concerning party walls, suggesting that townhouses would be the most important building type for the city, as they certainly became on Capitol Hill. Most significantly, the regulations shaped the future orderly growth of the city by requiring every house within the city has to stand square on the streets, and every lot, even those on the divergent streets, should run square. Here you see this as on an early printing of the L'Enfant Plan. This requirement guaranteed that the neighborhood could be built in fits and starts and still be a coherent whole. This also explains one of the great delights of the Capitol Hill neighborhood, that in some cases, houses that were built decades apart sit very happily side by side. In fact, the small city with its huge footprint in the Capitol Hill neighborhood grew erratically. Around 1820, John Duncan, a Scottish visitor, observed, I quote here, "Of all the regularity and system which the engraved plan for the city exhibits," he's referring to the L'Enfant Plan, of course, "scarcely a trace is discernible upon the ground." Instead of beginning this gigantic undertaking in a central spot and gradually extending the buildings from a common focus, they appear to have commenced at once in 20 or 30 different places without the slightest regard to concentration or the comforts of good neighborhood. In this map of 1836, created by H.S. Tanner, you can see the truth of Duncan's observations. Old city part of Washington, you can see that the development is trending toward the west. And in this detail showing Capitol Hill, you can see the general areas of development as well as some specific structures. You can see that growth on the hill was focused first around the Capitol building, you can see it there, especially on the east and the south, and then growth came from the Navy Yard, which was the center of employment, and was moving north and then west. The specific details on this map are also fascinating. Number 25, which you see here, alone, sitting grandly alone on its block, is Christ Church Episcopal, which of course is still in place today. Number 28 here is St. Peter's Catholic Church, another familiar site. Over here, just south of the Capitol, interestingly, is Henry McNeil Turner's Israel Bethel African Methodist Episcopal Church. It was said to be a stop on the Underground Railroad, and it was the first place in Washington where African-American troops were enlisted for. Number 4 here is another church, suggesting the diversity of the neighborhood. But of course, the other wonderful thing about this map is that this entire area, everything else was completely empty. Here's another slide to give a sense of that emptiness in the 1830s. This is a view from across the Anacostia River showing the Navy Yard and the hill with a few buildings mostly nestled near the Navy Yard. This is the great ship shed that you see in lots of different images. You can see that the Capitol is a little out of proportion, but nonetheless, there it is with the rounded bull French dome, which was completed in 1823. The Iron Dome that we see today would come several decades later. As the mid-19th century approached, the city continued to grow, and we're able to trace quite precisely where buildings were located soon after mid-century. This is due to the so-called Boschke map of 1857. Here is the slide that shows the map at the Library of Congress. The map maker, Boschke, actually hired a team of surveyors who, in principle, at least, recorded every city, every structure in the city to scale. This then becomes our earliest record of specific houses in the neighborhood. I'll talk more about this little version you're looking at here, which shows these big crease lines, is in the Library of Congress, and it shows its full extent. There's a huge amount of detail, though, and here is a close-up of the Capitol Hill area. You can see the Marine Barracks here, again, Christ Church, and buildings on 8th Street, which already was a major commercial thoroughfare in 1857. And here's another detail of the Boschke map. You can see here one of the characteristics of the neighborhood, the development of neighborhood development, as buildings in empty lots seem to randomly be spaced across the area, with some blocks, such as these here, heavily built, and then this one and the one 759 across East Capitol Street, entirely empty. And I'm going to show you another detail of the Boschke map, which may be the most fascinating of all, showing Hill East between 17th and 18th Streets, south of Independence Avenue. This is in 1857, and you can see what seem to be pathways meandering through the area. And a cemetery here, which is now, this is north of Congressional Cemetery, and it's now entirely disappeared. The streets are entirely theoretical.
Maygene,
Interestingly.
Maygene, I'm sorry to interrupt you. The arrows that you're using, we can't see them for some reason. So just so you know that when you're pointing things out.
Oh, right.
You might want to just describe where they are on the map.
Oh, thank you.
Sorry about that. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you. Not a problem. Glad you told me. Interestingly, concerning the Boschke map, it said that after a few copies were printed, printing plates were seized by early in the Civil War by Secretary of War Stanton, presumably to protect the city in case of rebel invasion, given the high accuracy of the map. While a few houses survive from before 1857, many more are from the next decades, when the hill was impacted by the Civil War and the accompanying city growth. With the Navy Yard and Marine Barracks here, the hill was a center of military activity. Here you see a woodcut of Marines drilling near the Commandant's house on 8th Street. And here's a photograph of Lincoln Hospital, the largest military hospital in the city during the war, that was built just east of Lincoln Park when casualties were mounting during the Civil War. After the war, it becomes easier to track building on Capitol Hill.
Yes.
Here we see an 1873 map by the company Fates, which, like the Boschke map, shows the footprints of houses, but more than streetcar routes, sewers, water plugs, and more. The infrastructure of a modern city. The map is wonderful, but there's also an atlas that goes with it, which would have been easier to show you and probably more interesting, but it's not accessible with research rooms closed. Here's a detail of the map showing those same blocks of East Capitol Street that I showed earlier. You can see from the bottom. Most of the lots have been filled in by this time. Note particularly Square 760, which was completely empty in 1857, but now has an extended row of houses. Here, this is Grants Row, which was completed in 1871, and at the time was one of the most ambitious developments in the city. You see the Capitol to the right of the photograph. The Grants Row turned out to be a financial fiasco, and it was torn down in 1929 to make way for the Folger Shakespeare Library. But while East Capitol Street near the Capitol was heavily built up, you can see that at this time in 1874, Lincoln Park between 11th and 13th Street remained at the edge of development. You see it in the upper portion of this slide, Lincoln Square, which has the romantic, graceful curving pathways. Square 989 in the center of the slide was built in, it's just Philadelphia Road. That's that unbroken row of buildings, and that was built in 1866 as a speculative venture by developer James Gesford, and of course it still remains there. But you can also see around this area that there's very, very little development. Notably, the park itself is not surrounded by the beautiful homes that eventually soon afterwards were constructed. And again, here's east. Again, you can see the delight of these maps, both seeing the emptiness of the blocks, but also in the lower right-hand corner, you can see that the General Hospital, more or less, was placed. There's an almshouse in 1873. It becomes already we can track specific buildings, many of which survive, and this becomes for structures built in 1804 or later, when the city began to require building permits. This bureaucratic addition provides precise and accurate building information on structures at a time when the major boom on Capitol Hill was beginning. Permits from 1874 to 77 can no longer be found, but they new and some information survives. Beginning in 18 until the present, building permits are available as the principal, most reliable source of new building information. I'm sure many of you have encountered the need to have permits in the current era for construction. The 19th century system was a precursor. All of the permits from 1877 through 1949 are at the National Archives and have been microfilmed with copies in several different places. But unfortunately, they're not available now given COVID restrictions. But in time, you should be able to construct them easily. On the screen, you're looking at an example of a building permit. This one from the Henry Adams house on H Street Northwest by famed architect Henry Hobson Richardson. And here's a detail of the permit, which is a little easier to read. You'll see that the permit has lots of detailed information, and in many cases, permits were accompanied by lovely facade drawings. Many houses on Capitol Hill have applications such as this with detailed information. Fortunately, even though the original permits are inaccessible at the moment, though, the basic permit information is easily available via an extraordinary online resource that I'll describe soon. Before I get there, though, I'll show you some other sources you can consult during COVID. In the late 1960s, here's my next slide. In the next 19th century, real estate atlases and fire insurance maps with one detailed drawings and information of the neighborhood began to be published. Here you see the front page of volume 2 of the Hopkins Real Estate Plat Book of 1893. And here you see an example of one of its pages, a detail showing East Capitol Street, the area that we've been looking at before. Buildings shown in pink are brick, those in yellow are frame. The outlines, the footprints that have X's in them, such as those directly under the number 760 at the bottom of the, those were brick sheds or stables. So you can see the houses of Grants Row. You can see the layout of the floor plan of those buildings, and across the street in Square 759, you see that there's a mix of brick and frame buildings, and of course some interesting outbuildings, just again under the 759. Later, Sanborn fire insurance atlases and based atlases were published that also give precise, detailed information on buildings and streets. Here is the cover page of the 1904 Sanborn Atlas. And here's a detail of one of the plats, plus the key to the buildings. In the center of the screen, you'll see Pennsylvania Avenue, and just north, you'll see a pink square that's Wallach School, which was torn down many years ago, and the original Eastern High School. You also see the corner of Pennsylvania Avenue and D Street, and what's now the Eastern Market Plaza. Many of these buildings remain, of course, but of course some have disappeared over time, especially the schools. The atlases continued to be published through much of the 20th century and offer an amazing source to track changes over time as structures are built and replaced. So now we turn to real examples. This is a slide, of course, of the 600 block of East Capitol Street. This was a very quick overview of the sources. I'll now try to show you how to approach research, hopefully in a very easy, accessible way that all of you can do this evening or soon. I call this the 5 easy steps for online research. I'll explain the steps here, and you can find the document that lists them in one of my handouts on the CHRS website, or Chris will send it to you. The first step in this effort is amazing and rewarding. It's to look up the building on a website called HistoryQuest DC. This is an interactive GIS, geographic information system map of existing property, of current properties, with pop-ups that provide information of the existing. You can zoom in on specific buildings for pop-outs with the key information. The information is largely from building permits, but there are other sources as well. This is an amazing source to find this information about the building. It's an easy place to find the square and lot number of the building that you're interested in, something I always forget, plus the construction date, owner, architect, and more. The buildings are color-coded, with the oldest ones darkest and the newest a bright yellow. And here are some details that you may find interesting. The image on the upper left shows 630 G Street. You see the pop-up, and it's next to, you see the Christ's Church. You can see here the information system map says that it was built in 1857. What that really means is that the building shows up on the Boschke map in 1857. At the bottom, I have cut detail of that little piece of the Boschke map, so you can see yourself that that building, which is now in place, the 1857 map. It can be seen for slightly later buildings that were built between 1857 and 1874. They show on the map in a slightly lighter color of brown. And here you see 317 4th Street Southeast, which I picked somewhat randomly, but you'll see that it's listed as being built in 1874, and it speaks of the Fates and Pratt 1874 real estate directory. What that really means, again, is that it shows up in 1874, and it was built sometime between 1857 and 1874. There are a number of buildings on the Hill that fall in these categories, and there are ways to refine the date of construction and learn more about them, learn about it if you're interested. My next detail shows 713 D Street Southeast, which some of you may know is now the store Hill's Kitchen. The map shows current conditions. You can see that the Eastern Market residences are the big bright yellow block across Pennsylvania Avenue. You can see the CVS store between D Street and the Avenue, the Carnegie Library, and a lot of other features. There are, I'm sorry, I'll go backwards and show you also that this building was built in 1884, and it is, the information comes from the DC Historical Building Database. So you know that allowing for minor errors, it is correct. The original owner was M. Staniszewski and C. Schneider, and it was built, the architect was Emil S. Friedrich. The second page of the pop-up shows that it was actually one of 4 dwellings that were built at the same time at the estimated cost of $6,000. Pretty neat to have that information. It also notes that plans are on file. That means that the architect and builder submitted drawings together with the application to build, and those drawings are now at the National Archives. I can hardly wait to see them. Anyway, this was a very modest building. It had 2 stories. It was on solid land. It was built of brick, 16 feet wide. And here you see the picture of the four houses, all of them built, each of them built for $1,500 in 1884. This could be as far as you choose to go with your house research. It's a wonderful, quick research tool, and it opens a lot of possibilities in terms of understanding how our neighborhood was built. Moving to step 2 of my 5 easy steps, however, it's to examine those maps and atlases that I showed you a few minutes ago. The Boschke map and Fates and Pratt are important sources, but so are the atlases and real estate maps that provide extraordinary information on the city as it was built and on our own neighborhood. This is a small detail of the Hopkins Atlas of 1887, together with the key. You can see that the 4 buildings are up toward the top center on square 902. That wire line is the sewers, and you can see that well honest, these new buildings weren't the most modest buildings, that there still were many frame buildings on 8th Street which no longer exist. And of course, on the other side of block 902, on E Street, there was a very large stable, which you can see by the X that goes through the footprint. The atlases are online, and as a tip, you'll find that it's often best to look at the index to the volume to find which plate to look for. This is a larger detail of the area that includes 713 D Street. Oh wait, this is the Hopkins Atlas index, and you'll see that we're looking at plate 33. And here's a larger detail that includes 713 D Street. Lamps are shown as triangles. You'll see that there's one at the corner of the park at D Street and 7th. You see the sewers and inlets. Those are the wire lines with the little lozenges. It shows where the post box is, which, if you know where the post box is now, in front of the CVS at the corner of 7th and Pennsylvania Avenue, you'll see that it was there. It was there then. You see that little square. And maybe most interesting, you'll see the, let's see, if you look at square 902 or square 876, the bottom right corner of square 876, there's a little circle that is a well. Amazing. You can spend hours and hours with these atlases, as you can see. You can also see the different paving materials. Let's see. The yellow indicates the pale blue on 8th Street is block stone, and the white that you see for North Carolina Avenue means paving of any kind at all, meaning that it was mud. So my step 3 of the 5 easy ways to learn about your home is to check another amazing online tool. That's the DC Architects Directory. It has hundreds of useful, detailed biographies of the architects that were active in DC, especially the 19th and 20th centuries, which are the decades when Capitol Hill construction booming. Friedrich was the architect of the building at 713 D Street, and here's his biographical entry. You sort of see what it looks like, though you can hardly read it, but you'll trust me that it's full of surprises. We learn from it that he was a prolific architect. I'd never heard of him, but he designed many, many row houses throughout the city, including these 2 row houses at 321 and 333 East Capitol Street, an early building at Gallaudet University, and the Capitol Hill Presbyterian Church. step, number 4, is the personal name search. This step begins to feel a bit like a mystery hunt in the vein of Miss Marple or Hercule Poirot, because you can go as deep as you want to, and creativity and care are needed to find interesting clues. Sometimes it's easy, sometimes it's less so. City directories for most years for DC are widely available online. As you see here, the 1885 Boyd's directory, the frontispiece. Directories from 1914 to 1973 have reversed listings, so you can actually go to the directories and look up the address that interests you just by the address, and then you find the name and go back to the name directory and learn, with luck, you learn a little bit more. This can be, I warn you, quite tedious because it's very hard to scroll through the pages, but nonetheless, the directories are available. They're available in many different sources, most easily, I think, on Ancestry.com, which is available online via the DC Public Library. You can expand endlessly to related names and other sources, including genealogical sources such as the census and name searches on newspapers, which are now often possible. In the case of 713 D Street, an introductory search was surprisingly easy and revealing. Fortunately, Stanisky is an uncommon name, and it turns out that Michael Stanisky is listed in the 1888 city directory as a harness maker who lived 1 block away at 657 Pennsylvania Avenue. We know that there was a saddlery there. One of the oral histories on the Overbeck website mentions it. So you can see the pieces are fitting together. The 1915 directory lists Mrs. Annie M. Scherer, a GPO machine operator residing at 713D. So we're also getting a picture of who lived there and their modest circumstances. There's almost no limit to search possibilities. So finally, we'll move on to step 5, which I elegantly call everything else. This will depend on what the home is or the building is that you're interested in, and a lot of other factors, especially how much energy you want to put into this. But there's a lot out there that's available. This is certainly a time to look more closely at the architectural features of the house to confirm that the pieces fit together. Is what you see online, does it make sense? What about neighboring houses? Were there additions? Were there noteworthy buildings nearby? Any one of these things can give you a direction to search. And as I mentioned, many, many sources are available. A number of Capitol Hill buildings have been recorded for the Historic American Building Survey. This is usually noted on the History Quest DC site. Here you see this wonderful line drawing of this East Capitol Street elevation of the houses in the 600 block of East Capitol Street. Hab's reports are at the Library of Congress and very easily available online. The Capitol Hill Restoration Society website includes some house histories, plus catalogs that include descriptions of all of the houses that were ever on house tours, which includes many, many at this point. Many images of Capitol Hill from about 1950 can be found on the WeimersDC.com website. There are 2 ways to get access to the Weimers photographs. One is there's a searchable GIS map, much like the History Quest DC, or you can work through the Historical Society of Washington catalog, which now has thumbnails of every one of these images, many on Capitol Hill. So this is this amazing photograph of what was on the southeast corner, the southwest corner kitty corner across the street from Lincoln Park at the southwest corner of 11th Street Southeast in North Carolina Avenue. Buildings that are long gone, except the one, the building at the corner that appears to be a theater has long been gone, but the two buildings further off to the left are still in place. So the Library of Congress and the Historical Society of Washington have amazing online catalogs with images of maps and photographs. And you can spend many, many happy hours online with them. Remember also that Google is your friend. You can look all sorts of things up. So when research rooms open, there's more places that you can go, and I will very quickly mention them. You can view the microfilm of the building permits. They're at several places, and they're quite easy to access. The important thing to remember about the microfilm is that it will include not only the information about houses that remain, but also the ones that have been torn down. Plus, it has repair and addition permits, and of course the National Archives at College Park has the building permit drawings. Let's see, you can also examine tax and assessment directories in hard copy. Those from their big, they're big volumes, handwritten in the early days. The pre-1877 volumes are at the National Archives. The ones from 1877 to 2009 are on microfilm at the DC Public Library. You can check deeds. The ones prior to 1921 are at the DC Recorder of Deeds, and those from 1921 to the present are online. And there's the DC Archives, which you can visit for birth certificates, death certificates, marriage records, wills and probate records, indentures of apprenticeship records. So to help, my second handout is a very long, dense table of sources, both online and available in research rooms, which you can use for reference. It's important to remember that it's almost impossible to capture everything, and that the information changes often, that more things are being put online all the time. But I hope that it will be useful as you pursue this interesting quest and learn more about your own house and our neighborhood. Many thanks for your attention, and perhaps we can open the floor for questions now.
So much, Maygene. This is really wonderful. So for questions, what I think we'll do is if you can ask them either way. You can just take your phone off mute or your computer off mute and then go ahead and ask a question, or type something in the chat. I'll monitor the chat and give them any questions you have to Maygene. So does anybody have any questions? Just remember to take your computer off mute, because everybody's on mute right now.
So I have a question.
Go ahead.
Could you introduce yourself? I can't see your pictures because you can see my screen.
My name's Larry Meinert, and I live at 128 F Street Southeast. We followed your directions and looked up our house, and it lists the cost at $117,000, which would be impossible in 1898 when the house was built. So how do I interpret what that price might mean?
I think that I would interpret that whenever, it's the GIS map is a secondary source. And so what I think it means is probably somebody's finger tripped, and there's really not much to do until you can really look at the original building permits on microfilm, hopefully before too long. I'd guess that it's a typo, honestly. because you're right, it would be absolutely impossible that would unless, let me take that back and say, I'm assuming, especially at that address, that it's the price for a single house. I mean, it would have to be lots and lots of houses for that price. But the $6,000 for Hill's Kitchen, for example, is for 4 houses.
Right. As near as I can tell from looking at it, it's for 2 houses, 128 and 130. But as you said, that doesn't make sense either. It'd have to be 50 houses.
Exactly. Well, that's a reason why it's wonderful to have multiple sources, because any mistake, any source can have a mistake in it, and that includes the original sources too. You know, if if the Boschke map shows that there wasn't a building in place, but archaeological evidence shows that there definitely was, well, then there was a mistake. Well, that's humans. So is that helpful? So, yeah.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, you're looking at a picture of the church at 7th and A Street Northeast, at the corner there. I haven't looked up who designed that one.
Hi, I have a question. Susan Savati.
Hi, Susan.
Nice to see you without your mask.
Yes, right.
Could you comment or give some resources to learn about how demographics have changed in the area? For example, since we moved in, which was in 1989, we noticed so many young families and babies and much younger. Yeah. So is there any place that we can look up that sort of information on the demographic changes?
I'm not aware of a really simple, clever way to do that. But of course, that's a lot of that is census data. And the Census Department publishes all sorts of information about the composition of census districts. Earlier, when questions come up about what the racial makeup, for example, of the area was, the city directories are fantastic sources because they indicate an address and they indicate whether what the person's race was. So it takes a lot of effort, but you can work through it. And of course, one of the interesting things right from the beginning was that people of all races were all mixed together. That doesn't speak to people's ages, but again, census data might be helpful. It's a great question. A lot of interesting directions to go from there. Yeah.
Thank you.
Hey, Maygene, there's a question in the chat room.
Okay.
Says from Stephen Morris, great presentation. When I checked his requests, it showed Stephen Flanagan as the builder of Philadelphia Row, but you mentioned James Gesford. Do we actually know?
That's a really interesting question. I picked up that, where did I got that, where did I get that? That was in one online sources, but maybe it just proves that online sources aren't so reliable. What was the name of the architect that you knew of?
He says Stephen, oh no, he says that Stephen Flanagan was what it was listed in his request, as opposed to James Gesford. Oh, I don't know.
I'm sure that that's known information and I just don't know it. And I once again just say that, History Quest, my understanding of the process that it was created is that it was, there was a database, an access database that was created, I'm pretty sure at the Historical Society of Washington. And then that database became the basis for History Quest. So if there was an error somewhere, it's there. And I do know of some things. Another example is actually Grants Row, which in some places I saw was listed as 1874, but then more convincingly it was listed as 1871. So for Philadelphia Row, I'm going to look that up. I'm sure that that's known information. It's just that I don't know that information, and I may have been wrong.
Here's another question. I've heard that all property records were lost in a 1900 fire. And so that is why so many buildings close to the Capitol have 1900 as their construction date. Can you clarify this?
I don't believe that something may have burned, but I'm not sure what it was. And they have 1900 as their construction date because that's when they were constructed. Does that answer that question? In other words, they were real. If I understand correctly, it's that the records that show the pre-1900 records were destroyed, and that's not the case. Did I answer that question?
Anybody, feel free to take your I don't know if that's Susan Sephardi or not.
Hi. This is Joel on the other side. I did some research, and the architect for our house, which was built in 1900, was a architect named Edward Woltz. I was wondering if you know any information about him.
I don't, but I'd suggest you look at Architect, whatever it was called, Architect Quest. That's not what it was called.
Yeah, I did.
Did you look?
He seemed to have worked on the Grace Baptist Church, so I think he might be an architect there as well.
Oh, interesting. Well, that's the best source. And if you want to go beyond that, you can do a person search just as you would on anything else. You could find out where he lived in the city. You could go to the AIA and see if they have more detailed. I suspect that they were an important source for the architects. That's very interesting, though. It is interesting to see, first of all, that in the case of 713 D Street, which I was really surprised that there was an architect at all, because it's a rather simple building. But it's also how there were certain architects that worked around the neighborhood, as there are still.
Hi there. My name is Leona, and this is Garrett, and we're at 706 11th Street Southeast. And when we bought our house, the deed officially says 1870, but in some of the information we were given, and the former owner thought that it was built actually in 1840 originally. And so we just looked it up on History Quest. It shows that it's first showing up on that later census, the 1874 one. But when we look at the Botchke map, you can see a very small structure in the lot is already there. So how could we start to explore and try to figure out, what was there, and was it in 1840, and what was that history?
And is it possible that they just tore down a smaller building and put something else up, or what? Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Anything is possible. And, it's also a time for you to look at the architecture of the building. Is it, small frame, low ceilings, hip roof, that kind of thing? Yeah, well, the way that, unfortunately, the way to get the best information is through tax and assessments, because that's where, you'll see a low number and then a high number that will show that a building was built. It won't tell you what the building was, but it'll tell you what, it'll tell you that something is there. And unfortunately, we can't do that during COVID, but it should be really interesting. The other thing, of course, is looking at city directories, and it's a little bit more, in fact, it's a lot more time consuming, but it's actually quite fun. And in the early years, the city wasn't that big, and the city directories are, except for the ones in the 20th century, they're organized by location. So you have to sort of put your finger on it and go down and, look for the nearby houses. So maybe you do that during a very boring Zoom call or something. But that's another way that when somebody turns up living there, then So I hope that's helpful. There's no easy answer, but there's a lot that's pretty exciting and fun.
Thank you.
Are there more questions? We have about 4 minutes before we end.
I see here that Betty Ann Kane raised a hand.
Oh, whoops, I'm muted. Go ahead. I'm sorry, I can't see any hands, so feel free to just jump in.
And it may not be true, so.
Yep, I had to unmute. Can you hear me?
Yes, yes.
Okay. Now, my question was on the city directories and how, when did they stop making the real city directories that had all the kind of information that you needed? I remember running for office, we used something called the crisscross, which were those. And of course, then you had the telephone books. Now we don't have anything.
I know.
Everybody's got a cell phone, and it's very hard to get a printed. If you're I was trying to do the whole sequence of ownership or occupying of our particular property, which we've been in for 51 years this spring. So I know the first 51 or the last 51 years, and the person that we bought it from. But what was the sequence and the kind of history of being able to use the city directories, then the crisscross, and then the telephone books?
I can't really speak to the telephone books, and I find the lack of telephone books quite frustrating now because it is very hard to track people down. But as we also know that there's a lot that's available online, and I really just simply don't know in modern times. Working backwards, though, the crisscross directory covers most of the 20th century, and that's hugely useful. And then before that, the city directory was just names, but the thing that makes them very fun is that certain years they indicate not only name, but they indicate race, either white or colored, and they also
occupation sometimes.
Yeah, and occupation, so that that's thinking of the social history of the neighborhood. That becomes an important and very interesting source. And, again, the architecture is the other really interesting and important source about the social history of the neighborhood, because so many of the houses were built, they're fairly modest, and they were built then for workers at the manual workers, sometimes workers at the Navy Yard, or clerks at the Capitol or downtown.
Yeah, it was interesting when I looked up ours. House, I forget, was 1874, 85 or so. But the architect, the builder of it, I then found, we're in the 100 block of 5th Northeast. The builder of it was living or had been living in the unit block of 5th Northeast, where they're all the wooden flat fronts. And
interesting.
The brick ones from later on. So you obviously, I haven't followed up too much of it yet because all the history center closed, but it's interesting. He was in the neighborhood living in one of the earlier flat front ones. He was a carpenter, but was obviously had something to do with the building of our house and the whole block that we were in, the next block.
Yeah, that's fascinating. It's fascinating. And it's also interesting to consider. I'm sure that Capitol Hill was a community then, the way it is now, with people each other. Transportation was a different thing. Of course, the history of the transportation is another very interesting thing. Yeah. As now this area is kind of cut off from the development in Northwest Washington. So there's every reason why people worked together, they lived together, they shipped close by. Really interesting.
Yes.
We'll just ask one quick question. I'm sorry to cut this short, but it is 7:30, so I don't want to impose on your time too much. There is this hopefully is a quick question. What is the crisscross directory?
Oh, good question. It means that there are actually two directories side by side. One is what we're used to, alphabetical, Daniels, comma, Stephen. But the other is by address, 713D Street or whatever. So that to use a city directory that doesn't have crisscross, you need to know the name of the person, obviously, which again, there are clues. And if you start in one place and move backwards, you can find things out, but it's much more difficult. So crisscross, you do it by address. And the only thing that's I find them a little difficult to use because it requires patience, because it's not entirely clear whether D Street comes before or after Davenport Street, for example. You just have to kind of work your way through it, but they're a great source.
Yeah, they had phone numbers in them too, which was great for elections.
That's wonderful.
Where I'm familiar with them from, but yes. Yeah.
Great. Well, I hope that this is an introduction for everyone and that you enjoy living here and dip your toe in or go in full force to learning about the history of the neighborhood, because there's so much to learn. Thank you all.
Thank you, Maygene. This was like such fun. I really appreciate your time. Really wonderful presentation. Thank you. We'll go ahead and end it here, although I do want to mention we're going to be having 3 presentations coming up. One is March 17th. You'll remember that because it's on St. Patrick's Day. The Botanic Gardens and the Senate Park Commission, 3 decades of controversy. April 21st, building a mosaic in your house. May 19th, adaptive reuse of our alley buildings. So those should be a lot of fun, and we hope to see you all. We had a great group today. So again, thank you, and thanks to for everyone from CHRS. Thanks, Maygene.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Bye. Bye, everyone.